I'm going to be talking to economist Michael Bernstein, who is the executive director of Clean Prosperity, about yesterday's federal budget and what it means for the federal government's emissions reductions plan, which was announced last week. So, welcome to the interview, Michael.
Hi, Markham.
Now, this is a really interesting budget. There is a lot in here for energy and climate. If you could just start us off with a bit of an overview.
Sure. Yeah, there were a number of policy announcements and investments announced within the budget. I'd say largely they were focused on industrial decarbonization and had a focus on trying to leverage private capital to help decarbonize the industrial sector. And I'll mention a couple of the key pieces. One was an investment tax credit for carbon capture and storage technology. And that includes both capture at traditional industrial plants, but also there was a higher rate announced of 60% for carbon dioxide removal technologies. And I think that was a really important part of this, which we can come back to if you want. The second piece was there was a new fund of $15 billion announced, a Canada Growth Fund, which is explicitly about unlocking private capital for major decarbonization projects. And we don't have a lot of detail on that yet, but hopefully that'll be forthcoming. There was also a direction to the Canada Infrastructure Bank to direct more of their funding towards low carbon technologies, things like hydrogen and storage and other kinds of low carbon projects. There was additionally about $4 billion for a set of critical minerals policies and programmatic investments. And so I think overall, what you saw in the budget was a pretty strong commitment to figuring out how we're going to mobilize the kind of dollars we're going to need, which is many, many billions of dollars towards getting the decarbonization that's going to be required this decade.
Yeah, that was one of the questions I had when I was reading the budget summary, is that there's a lot in there. There's a fair amount of money sprinkled across many programs, many buckets, policy buckets, if you will. But arguably coming up short in many of those areas. But if you look at it from the context of what you just said, where that money is designed to then leverage private capital into these kinds of projects like CCUS, then maybe that makes more sense.
I think so. Look, ultimately, we have such a massive job ahead of us to decarbonize. I've often said that to reach anything like that 40% target by 2030, 40% emissions, that is, by reduction in emissions by 2030, it's kind of like cramming for a midterm exam. And you only have a few hours left in the night. I mean, we are really behind and it's going to be really challenging. So it's going to be important for the government, in my view, to really focus on those key market barriers and obstacles to mobilizing the tens and tens of billions of dollars in private capital that is going to be needed to actually do this job. So I think while we did see a number of encouraging steps in the budget, one of the things I would say is there could be more work done to try to coordinate and prioritize, because there is a staggering number of ideas that have been put out in the budget and prior to that.
Let's talk about carbon capture, utilization, and storage, because that did get funding, a fair amount of funding. The government said very clearly that that's going to be a focus coming in the coming years. But there wasn't nearly as much money as even Alberta was asking for. For the oil and gas industry, Alberta Premier Jason Kenney was asking for $30 billion. Like, cut me a check for $30 billion, please. And this one, I think, is $2.6 billion for the first 5 years, and then $1.5 billion a year after that. And then after 2030, the tax credit gets cut in half. So it was a lot less than the one industry was asking for. But then, of course, there are other industries like cement and so on.
Yeah, so the way that policy was designed, and I talked to some finance officials after the budget about this, is that it is an open-ended offer for a 50% credit to any legitimate projects that come forward in the next 5 years. So while the federal government, you're right, did specify something like $2.5 billion over the next 5 years, that's an estimate. The reality is it could exceed that by quite a bit. But what I think is really critical here is that the government thinks of this investment tax credit as a time-limited bridge to other policies like carbon pricing, really doing the bulk of the heavy lifting to incentivize decarbonization. We just have a few years here where the price is not yet sufficient to mobilize capital. And I think this credit will be helpful to get projects off the ground.
What's your take on the electricity sector? Because there were some announcements like the Pan-Canadian Grid Council, I have to say, was a disappointment to me. Only $2.4 million, to get it up and running, and it's being perceived as a, kind of an advisory council. It's going to provide advice and background information for governments and ministers. And whereas I think when it was pitched, during the last federal election, it was meant to be more of exercising federal leadership to get provinces trading electricity east and west, so that the hydro provinces could act as storage for provinces like Alberta and Saskatchewan that have lots of renewable potential. That seemed to be a disappointment. What's your take on it?
Well, I think there's going to need to be a package of policies that are put together to decarbonize electricity. I do think that Grid Council could be an important part of a comprehensive package. And so in that respect, it's a little hard for me to assess whether $2 million is sufficient. It certainly doesn't seem like a lot of money. But from my mind, what I would really like to make sure happens is the federal government has announced a clean electricity standard by 2035. Where does that fall in the priority list of the dozens and dozens and dozens of policies that have been announced over the last few months? And furthermore, how do we firm up carbon pricing, which is going to be another key part of this? So what I think actually is most needed now is to get a sense of prioritization from the government of what are the top 3, 5, even 10 policies that are going to be the highest impact and are going to take the government's greatest focus going forward.
Yeah, I would say that's fair enough, because there's a lot going on in the federal government. If you go through their list of policies around climate and energy, it's a very, very long list. Well, let's talk about some of the other sectors like transportation. Now, there's an extension there's more money for subsidies, for consumers to buy zero emission vehicles, and there'll be a sales mandate coming quite shortly. What's your take on that?
Well, I think transportation is another area where we need to understand what are going to be the levers that are going to be introduced in the next year or two, because that is one of the sectors that has the longest lead times to change. And I think you saw in the emissions reduction plan that I believe it was under 10% reduction relative to 2005 that they're aiming for by 2030. So much below, for example, the oil and gas sector, which you referred to earlier, is over 40%. So I think we just need to get a more coherent sense of what are the policies that are going to be put in place over the next year or two, among ZEV subsidies, and we have these mandates, and we have a whole variety of policies. So I just want to understand what are the key drivers in that sector, and what is going to be put in place to get emissions down in the near term in that sector.
Now, we've talked about transportation, power, and industry, and the fourth sector usually is, when we have these conversations, is building stock.
Mm-hmm.
And what did the government have in place for decarbonizing Canada's building stock?
I think buildings is actually where we have the most holes in the plan of any sector. And so the government did commit in the emissions reduction plan released recently that they're going to develop a strategy for how we're going to get to net zero in the building sector. But that is the one place where we just don't have a clear picture. We don't have even a set of policies that have been announced that come anywhere close to meeting the scale of the challenge. We're going to have to retrofit probably 7 million buildings in Canada by 2050. That's about 1,000 buildings a day for the next 28 years. It's just not clear how we're going to do that. So I think that's one area I hope the government is working on that and working on that quickly. But at this point, we don't have a clear picture.
Well, Michael, thank you very much for this. Always appreciate your insights.
Thanks, Markham.